Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of Revolutionary Mothers and Fathers on History for Shut-ins. For those that are watching the tape presentation, please fast forward to the 3-minute portion of the recording. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode number 6 of Revolutionary Mothers and Fathers on History for Shut-ins. Today we are going to discuss Benedict Arnold, Mercy Otis Warren, Nathanael Greene, and Alexander Hamilton. We will be taking a digital snow day tomorrow, Thursday, March 26th. We'll return on Friday, March 27th at noon with a new session on the Revolutionary War. Today's flag is the Moultrie flag, also known as the Liberty flag. It was created by Colonel William Moultrie when he was ordered to take Fort Johnston on James Island in Charleston Harbor during the Revolutionary War, early in the war. It is the first U.S. flag that was flown in the South and is the basis for South Carolina's state flag. My shirt today is the Gadsden flag, which was created in 1775, of course has been used and seen more lately over the past few years. One interesting thing that I just realized, the number of rattles on the rattlesnake is 13, one for each colony. So we will get started today with Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold met George Washington in July of 1775 when Washington had taken command of the newly formed Continental Army in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Because of Arnold's taking and keeping of Fort Ticonderoga in May and June of that year, Washington decided to ask Arnold to lead a column into Canada to take Quebec City, which at the time, Canada, and still to this day, is a British possession, part of the United Kingdom. Arnold did so, suffering a serious wound on the last day of 1775 in a failed attempt to capture the city. Arnold went on to fight successfully in 1776, helping to keep the British from invading the colonies through the Lake Champlain region, which is, of course, on the Canada and U.S. border around New York. His greatest victory is Saratoga in 1777, which leads to French recognition and greater assistance of the colonies during the Revolution. Fought 18 days apart in the fall of 1777, the two battles of Saratoga are a turning point in the war. On September 19th, British General John Burgoyne achieved a small but costly victory over U.S. forces that were led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Though his troop strength was declining, Burgoyne again attacked the U.S. at Bemis Heights on October 7th, but was defeated and forced to retreat. 10 days later, he surrendered. The U.S. victory then convinced the French government to formally recognize the colonist cause. And again, the French aren't doing it because they are fans of Republican government. They are doing it to take a bite out of Great Britain and their empire. The 1777 British invasion from Canada took place, of course, after capturing Fort Ticonderoga with ease. The British Army, led by an overconfident John Burgoyne, crawled south, giving the rattled colonials time to regroup under Horatio Gates. To support Gates, Washington sent Benedict Arnold, his best infantry commander. He sent Colonel Daniel Morgan and his crack regiment of Virginia riflemen. And he sent 2 brigades of Continentals from the Hudson Highlands. They helped to increase Gates' strength to about 6,500. Equally important was Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who was a Polish engineer who built excellent field fortifications on Bemis Heights overlooking the Hudson River. There is a historical plaque to Kosciuszko in Center City, Philadelphia. On September 19th, 1877, Burgoyne attacks the colonials. Arnold prods Gates out of his defensive mentality, winning permission to lead Morgan's men and Henry Dearborn's light infantry into the woods to block a British flanking column. For most of the afternoon, there was a furious struggle back and forth, and it raged around a clearing called Freeman's Farm in Saratoga. Arnold pours in fresh regiments until Gates breaks off the action, leaving the battered British in possession of the ground. Arnold was aggressive. Gates tended to be more defensive and was not nearly as aggressive as Arnold. After fortifying his camp and waiting in vain for reinforcements from the state of New York, Upper New York, Burgoyne attempts another assault on October 7th. Arnold, ignoring orders from Gates to remain in his quarters, joins the fight and leads an attack that captures key strong points on the battlefield, forcing the British to retreat into Saratoga, which is modern-day Schuylerville in upstate New York. Surrounded by militia that came out late as word of the battle was spreading, Burgoyne surrenders 10 days later. Seriously wounded in the same leg which he had taken his first wound at Quebec, Arnold is angry that during more than 4 months in a Patriot military hospital, as he's recuperating in Albany, he is being forgotten. He had plenty of time, of course, to think of how much he has suffered and sacrificed, how he had been passed over for a higher rank, an insult to his good name as a virtuous patriot, and how much he had sacrificed in terms of his own personal wealth for the U.S. cause. So the seeds are being planted for Arnold's turn. He had been a lucrative trader and merchant operating out of New Haven, Connecticut. Congress had restored his rank before Saratoga, but not his seniority. When Washington writes Arnold in January of 1778 that Congress had finally restored his seniority, Arnold did not respond immediately. He was furious that Congress had actually cast a medal to Horatio Gates as the quote-unquote hero of Saratoga, when really it was Arnold who had provided field leadership. In June of 1778, Washington, knowing that Arnold, as he's recovering, cannot take a field command, names him the military governor of Philadelphia. This brings Arnold into contact with the head of Pennsylvania's government at the time, Joseph Reed. Reed had been bad-mouthing Washington as a bumbling commander while serving him as an aide all the way back to 1776. Think of what happens in 1777. Philadelphia falls to the British, and then the British, after several months, actually leave Philadelphia. So Reed is upset by that. That adds fuel to the fire. He wanted to get even with suspected Tories in Philadelphia who had aided the British during their occupation of the city from September of 1777, right after the Battle of Brandywine, to June of 1778. Reed resented Arnold being the governor, the military governor, if you will, and with orders that Arnold received from Washington to stabilize the situation and avoid needless retribution directed against loyalists. Peggy Shippen's family, who Arnold and Peggy Shippen meet and start a relationship and then ultimately get married, but her family tended to be more neutral than loyalists. Arnold meets her and falls in love with her. Arnold had lost his first wife in 1775. Peggy was attracted to Arnold, who was twice her age. Reed saw it as Arnold playing up to the very loyalist types he wanted to punish, although again, the Shippens were not technically loyalists. Arnold and Peggy get married in April of 1779. Determined to get Arnold, Reed trumps up several charges against him that attack Arnold's honesty, his character, and his reputation. Remember, at this time, if someone challenges any of those three, it could lead to a duel. The charges become public around the time of Arnold and Shippen's marriage, and Arnold finally has had enough. Peggy has contacts with British officers, including John Andre. She offers these contacts to Arnold, whose anger and dismay with the colonials for not showing their proper thanks to him for all that he has done leads him to begin communications with the British. Arnold's court-martial was in response to 8 charges lodged against him by Reed. Arnold says, "I want satisfaction and I want to be tried," but Congress refuses to support him. Reed, as a way to string Arnold along and really annoys him, kept asking for delays so that he could gather evidence to prove the charges. The charges were filed in early 1779, but the court-martial doesn't take place until December of 1780 and January of 1781. So a full year, almost 2 years later. Arnold is acquitted of all charges except two. He was found guilty of allowing a vessel to clear port in Philadelphia when the port was closed. Arnold had an investment in the vessel and the goods it was carrying. The other charge was using public wagons to move trade goods belonging to him. Arnold acknowledged the charge and said, yeah, I was paying for their use. Washington goes along with Reed's incessant delays because Reed kept threatening that he would not call out the Pennsylvania militia to support Washington's martial efforts if he was not given the time to dig up evidence, Reed, against Arnold. Washington, though, is actually trying to help Arnold, but couldn't because he needs the troops that Reed is trying to raise for the defense of Pennsylvania. The Court-Martial Hearing Board recommends to Congress that Arnold be publicly reprimanded and gave the assignment to Washington, who did so only in orders of the day. But that was enough for Arnold. To Arnold, Washington is now an enemy. Trying to decrease the tensions between the two, Washington offers Arnold command of a wing of the Continental Army. Arnold says, I want West Point. And of course, Washington gives it to him. Even though Arnold gains control or the lead of West Point, he believes that the Patriot cause has ruined him and his good name, and he then moves forward in working with Andre and the British in giving them the plans at West Point. And Arnold, of course, becomes the greatest traitor in the Revolution and possibly in American history. We will now discuss Mercy Otis Warren. She was born in Barnstable, Massachusetts in 1728. Her father was an attorney and a merchant who also played an active role in the political life of the Massachusetts colony. She was not given any formal education, but she was taught to read and write. Her older brother James had a tutor and would allow Mercy to sit in and learn during those sessions. In 1754, Mercy Otis marries James Warren. James Warren, remember, is famous for the famous line, taxation, or pardon me, let me take that back. They lived most of their life in Plymouth, Mass, and James Warren, like Mercy's older brother James Otis, was involved in the resistance to the British. It was James Otis, Mercy's brother, who actually is famous for the line, taxation without representation is tyranny. Yesterday, we talked about how James Otis fought writs of assistance. And I want to quickly describe what those are because I did not mention it yesterday. Writs of assistance were documents which served as a general search warrant, allowing customs officers to enter any ship or building that they suspected for any reason might hold smuggled goods. They were a useful tool in the fight against smuggling in the colonies. Remember, the British have closed down the port of Boston. There are non-importation acts by the colonials against the British. So many of them are on the two countries, and really between Massachusetts and Great Britain, there's a lot of smuggling going on. Shortly after implementation, Boston merchants, the group who are primarily responsible for smuggling, hired James Otis to challenge the constitutionality of the writs before the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in 1761 in what is known as the Petition of Lechmere. Otis argued that the writs were against the fundamental principles of law and claimed that an act of Parliament, quote, against the Constitution is void. unquote. He's talking about the Constitution of Massachusetts, although the true Constitution of Massachusetts, it's really the charter, the true Constitution does not come into play until 1780. It took 2.5 years before the ruling in the case was delivered. The writs of assistance and Otis's arguments at trial convinced many that the British had overstepped their bounds, and objections to their use was heard in town meetings, in taverns, at church, and assemblies throughout the colonies. So, getting back to Mercy Otis Warren, in 1772, a meeting at the Warren House initiated the committees of correspondence, which were used throughout the colonies for each colony to basically talk to each other and share information. Mercy continued her involvement by publishing in a Massachusetts periodical in 2 parts a play that she called The Adult Adulator, a tragedy. It depicted the Massachusetts colonial governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who we've talked quite a bit about, as hoping to, quote, smile to see my country bleed, unquote. In 1773, the play is published as a pamphlet. She publishes another play in 1773, The Defeat, followed in 1775 by The Group. In 1776, she publishes a farcical play called The Blockheads, also known as The Affrighted Officers. And it's published anonymously, but it's after the fact that people piece it together that it's Mercy Otis Warren that's put it together. She publishes yet another play, The Motley Assembly, which appears in 1779. Many of her plays are satire, and they're directed more at the United States than at the British. The plays were part of the propaganda campaign that helped solidify opposition to the British as the revolution's going on. In 1781, the Warrens purchased a home that, ironically enough, was owned by Thomas Hutchinson. They lived there for 10 years and then moved back to Plymouth. Mercy Otis Warren is among those who opposed the new Constitution of the United States, and in 1788 wrote about her opposition in, quote, Observations on the New Constitution, unquote. She believed that it would favor aristocratic over democratic government. In 1790, she publishes a collection of her writings as, quote, poems, dramatic, and miscellaneous. It includes 2 tragedies, The Sack of Rome and The Ladies of Castile. These plays were critical of U.S. aristocratic tendencies, which Warren feared were gaining strength, and also explored expanded roles for women on public issues and the new government. In 1805, Warren publishes what had occupied her time for several years. It was a 3-volume history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution. She documented what led to the revolution, how it progressed, and how it ended. She includes anecdotes from participants that she knew personally: John Adams, Abigail Adams, Sam Adams, as well as Thomas Jefferson. Her history favorably views Jefferson, who is, remember, he's not so much a Federalist as he is a Democratic Republican. The Federalists want a long central national government. So John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson is not a fan of that. She actually intimates in the history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution that John Adams had become pro-monarchy and overly ambitious. She wrote that, quote, his passions and prejudices were sometimes too strong for his sagacity and judgment, unquote. I guess that's an insult in 18th century America. She loses the friendship of John and Abigail Adams. John Adams then sends her a letter in 1807 saying, I disagree with what you've written here. And they exchange letters over the next 3 months, which become more and more contentious. A mutual friend of theirs, Elbridge Gerry, tries to reconcile the two in 1812 and is successful. Adams wrote Gerry that one of the lessons was, quote, history is not the province of the ladies, unquote. Mercy Otis Warren dies in 1814, and her history, and especially the letter writing back and forth with John Adams and the feud that ensued, plays a role in her being largely forgotten. Pardon me 1 second, I've gotten lost here. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. We're going to talk about Nathanael Greene. I mixed up my notes. This is what you get. You get what you pay for with the free Facebook Live. So we're going to talk about Nathanael Greene, who is one of my favorite generals from the Revolutionary War. He is one of the most respected generals of the war and a talented military strategist. He is commander of the Southern Department of the Continental Army. He leads a brilliant campaign as the British are losing north of the Mason-Dixon line. They say, hey, let's concentrate on the south and then work our way up the coast. Greene is sent to defend the south and does a phenomenal job. Although he had never fought a battle in Georgia, his leadership is the catalyst that turns the tide toward American victory, freeing Georgia from British forces. There is a county in northeast Georgia, Greene County, that is named after him. He is born in 1742 and grows up in Rhode Island. He is the son of Nathanael Greene, a businessman and a Quaker minister. Nathanael Jr. leads a quiet life in a blacksmith shop. He is an avid reader. He develops a keen early interest in military science, which upsets his family and the Quaker community because they are pacifists. He's elected to the Rhode Island legislature in 1770 and becomes a strong advocate for U.S. independence. After attending a military parade in 1773, his Quaker friends hear about it and they expel him from the meeting house. From then on, Greene chose to separate himself from the faith and becomes actively involved in military service. In 1774, he marries Catherine Littlefield and they have 6 children. She visits Greene often during the war and gains a reputation as an independent woman interested in politics and the military. In 1774, Greene helps form the Kentish Guards, which is a Rhode Island militia unit. He is only allowed to serve as a private in the group because he has no military experiences. Also, he has a slight limp that he has had since birth. Greene later commands the militia and becomes a brigadier general in the Continental Army, acting in the siege of Boston in 1776. His performance impresses Washington, who gives Greene the command of Boston after the British evacuate the city. At the age of 34, Greene is promoted to become the youngest major general in the Continental Army at that time. Not bad for somebody who has no military experience. 4 months later, the Marquis de Lafayette actually takes that title from Greene and becomes a major general at 19. Greene participates in the battles of Brandywine and Germantown and acts as a quartermaster at Valley Forge. So he is in the action. It also shows you the importance that Washington laid at Greene's feet. In 1780, Washington gives Greene the task of leading the Revolutionary Army of the South. The Army of the South already had 3 commanders whose failures had left the South in a weak and disjointed state. Greene and his men would face the most able of all British generals, Lieutenant General Charles Earl Cornwallis. His large and well-trained army was a daunting challenge compared to Greene's small, inexperienced, and poorly supplied force. Greene led a bold and ingenious fight against British occupation in the South. He knew, much like Washington, he knew that his army was incapable of going face to face, toe to toe, of winning any large or decisive battles. What he does is he uses the small size of his forces to make sudden, brief attacks on the slower moving, larger British army. Think of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee in the Civil War. Their forces, for the most part, are much smaller than Union forces, but they're able to move much more quickly and daringly. Greene knew that such a move would, if he divides his forces, then he knows that Cornwallis will have to do the same. And by doing that, he weakens Cornwallis's advantage. Greene also knew that such a move would have grave consequences for the British, greatly diminishing or extending, I should say, their supply lines. Greene then leads his men in a retreat that forces Cornwallis to follow the Continental Army far away from their base in Charleston. The British, because of this, because they're strung out over many, many miles, become less of a formidable force. As I said earlier, Greene did not fight in Georgia. By 1780, the British had secured half of Georgia, almost all of Georgia, and the remains of its government had dissolved under loyalist and royal rule. Greene took a personal interest in saving Georgia, sending his best generals for its protection and closely overseeing defense of the colony. In May of 1781, Patriots fought to regain control of Augusta, Georgia, which was a crucial town in the struggle for the colony. Greene sent an army under Colonel Henry Light Horse Harry Lee to support the colonial forces. As the first troops of the Continental Army to enter Georgia in more than a year, they really increased the morale of Georgia residents. With their help, Augusta was back under U.S. control within 2 weeks. In 1782, Greene came to the defense of Georgia again when he sends General Mad Anthony Wayne to Savannah. Greene directs Wayne's successful campaign, which pushed the British out of Savannah and into Georgia, literally and basically ending the occupation of Georgia by the British. Greene not only fought to secure the freedom of Georgia, but also worked with the state to revive its government, which had fallen under British occupation. He gained the respect and trust of its residents. They were eager to have his help in reorganizing their government. Greene encouraged the creation of an official Georgia Brigade, which gave the state a symbol that its residents could look to with pride and patriotic fervor. He oversaw the organization of a new constitutional government, and again, this is a state constitution, and worked closely with the leaders of Georgia. Greene advocates for the end of violence against loyalists, saying they will be our countrymen. They will be here once the war is over. Georgia then reinstates a secure civil government. Greene willingly gives much of his personal wealth, as did others, like Benedict Arnold, to help support the war, and John Hancock and the Adamses and whatnot. He sacrificed his Rhode Island home. To thank him for his service during the war, the Georgia government gives Greene a plantation named Mulberry Grove outside of Savannah. He lives on the estate less than a year as he's troubled by very insecure finances. The plantation never becomes profitable, and Greene dies in 1786 of sunstroke unexpectedly at the age of 44. One little historical note of interest: after Greene's death, Eli Whitney comes to Savannah to take a tutoring job. Whitney then begins working for Greene's widow. It's at Mulberry Grove, the farm given to the Greene family by the state of Georgia after the war, that Whitney invents the cotton gin. Last but not least, we are going to discuss Alexander Hamilton. As with many of the personalities that we have discussed, it is hard to pick one thing to discuss about Alexander Hamilton. However, one of the things that I've chosen is what I feel is one of the most important things that he has done to help the country get on the proper footing. On June 20th of 1790, when Congress is temporarily meeting in New York City, the Secretary of State, Jefferson, hosts a dinner. Hamilton, who is Secretary of the Treasury, is in attendance, as is James Madison, who is a representative from Virginia. Madison and Hamilton wrote the bulk of the Federalist Papers, which were used to gain public acceptance and favor of the U.S. Constitution. Hamilton, who is a Federalist, as we've discussed, wanted the federal government to hold the bulk of the political and economic power. Madison and Jefferson, Democratic Republicans, wanted the power to remain with the states. So pre-Constitution, that is Articles of Confederation thinking. Power goes to the states. Post-Constitution, we're now Federalist thinking in that the national government has to run the show for the most part. Of course, the states still have tremendous power. They all met to discuss a prolonged deadlock in Congress. The meeting is a pivotal turning point in what becomes known as the Compromise of 1790. In January of 1790, Hamilton had given his first on public unquote contentious issues is Hamilton's recognition of federal on the states solution, and some of the larger states pushed back because they had already paid their debt. So somebody like a Virginia is saying, why do I want to help Delaware or New Jersey or Massachusetts? And Hamilton is saying, we are only as strong as the weakest link. If one of them goes down, and again, this is now national thinking, then we're all in trouble. The larger states saying that they don't want to help the smaller states who have not paid their debt, again, is Articles of Confederation thinking. And Hamilton is trying to change this. Hamilton believes that it is necessary for the federal government to assume the states' war debts to establish the United States credit and promote investment from other countries. The debt at the time rested in the hands of a small number of wealthy citizens who had bought the debt from states and basically almost as a stock option, thinking that this is going to be worth more someday. Hamilton knew these men would take interest in the success of the country that owed them money. The assumption issue had been debated in Congress for months. Northern members supported it because their debts were largely unpaid, but Southern members, including Madison, opposed it because Southern states had paid off a significant portion of their debt. At the same time, Congress had been at a standstill over where to put the permanent capital. It had been Philadelphia. It had been New York. And again, as a way to unite the country, those in the South are saying, why don't you move it south? Although the Constitution mandated a seat of the federal government, it did not specify a location. Congress, over the course of the first year, looked at more than 12 potential locations. When Senator Senator Pierce Butler of South Carolina presented a new residence bill on May 31st of 1790, basically saying we need a location for the federal government, he leaves the location blank. The deadlock continues into June when the Senate fails to pass a motion to fill the spot with, quote, the easterly bank of the Potomac, unquote. The key was a bargain in which Madison agrees not to block assumption of state debt with his Southern peers and convince enough Southern members to do it as well. In exchange, Congress would pass legislation locating the capital city on the Potomac after a 10-year temporary stay to Philadelphia. Congress passes the Residence Act in July, establishing Washington, D.C. as the permanent capital, and then in August of 1790, Congress passed the Funding Act, which included the assumption of states' Revolutionary War debts, which again is a gigantic decision helping to set the country on the right economic footing. Think of what's happening in 1790. You're getting the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Hamilton, at the same time that all this is going on, is saying, why do we need to buy things from the French, the British, the Dutch, the Spanish? Let's set up manufacturing here. The North bites hard on that. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, all those areas say, yeah, we see value in this. Of course, southern cities and southern states are saying, why do we need it? Because we can't make enough cotton and sell enough cotton. So it's this is where you start to see the separation of the North from the South economically as manufacturing is set up in all these different areas. What then happens is as factories come up and are being built and instituted, where do immigrants come? They come to the North, which is why to this day, some of the most populous cities in the country, outside of Los Angeles, of course, are Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, on and on and on, because of the manufacturing that has been set up there for now almost 250 years. This is where we are going to end Revolutionary Mothers and Fathers. I am taking a digital snow day tomorrow, and we'll start Friday with a series on the Revolutionary War. If there are any questions, please feel free to leave them here, and I will answer them before our next session on Friday at noon on the Revolutionary War. Thank you to those that have joined live and to those that are watching the tape presentation. Enjoy your day, and I'll see you Friday at noon. Take care.